There we go. We get to see just how disconnected the consumer is relative to the what's best for the consumer, what the consumer wants, what the consumer thinks they want, relative to what's actually best for the consumer. And this pops up in a couple of really interesting ways with early iOS. So the first thing is to kind of remember, well, for many of you, you weren't necessarily thinking about this kind of stuff then, but first thing is to sort of recall that in the early days of iOS, there was not, well, the first year, there was not an app store. Okay, so all the apps that lived on the iPhone that very first year were Apple approved, Apple made, Apple, controlled all the decision making regarding what things would get involved in battery life, that kind of stuff. We didn't have all these other app makers who got involved in the equation. So now so in that very first year, one thing that, and also people probably didn't quite think about their smartphones as computers yet in that very first year. Now we kind of think of it as like a walking computer, and we have expectations of it that are the same as a full-fledged computer. But one thing that was interesting is that very first year of having an iPhone, you can only have one application running at once. So just to give a quick example of that, if you are a music listener, and let's say you're listening to, I don't know, Pandora or Amazon Music or whatever, you couldn't listen to music and browse the web and check your email at the same time. It was a one or the other thing. You had one application running in the foreground on the iPhone at a time. So if you put yourself in the situation of that, how many of you, well, I'm assuming most of you, when you're using your smartphones, you do more than one thing at once on there, even if it's just temporary. You're not necessarily using it as a major productivity machine, but it would be perfectly common for you to have music playing and you texting someone or something like that. That's something you could not have pulled off in the early days of iOS. Because it didn't support multitasking. So then the question comes down to, why didn't they support multitasking? Was this just Apple being jerks? Did they think multitasking just didn't make sense? What's the scoop? And we really saw this kind of open up about a year and a half later when Android, or come to the surface, I guess, about a year and a half later when Google released their Android operating system. Keep in mind that when Apple first came to market with their operating system, or with iPhone, people were kind of, leery about the success level. What does Apple know about phones and things like that? Obviously, history's told that story that it's worked out okay for them. But at that very beginning point, it didn't necessarily work. Nobody knew they were going to be successful. So there wasn't this rush to compete, because at the time, BlackBerry had a, kind of probably an industry lead in smartphones, and it was really focused more on business people and things like this. So iPhone was kind of our first, what we would call a smartphone today. So about a year and a half later, Android comes out with, Google comes out with their operating system, Android, that's running on various different competitor pieces of hardware, which is also an interesting decision thing there, where Google has their software running on different people's hardware, where Apple has their software running on their own hardware. Apple controls both sides of the equation, which also is going to play into what we're talking about here. And I'll kind of swing back into that here. Well, let me talk about that just a little bit. So, especially when we're talking about the architecture of the physical device, be it the processors or the how big the battery, things like that, some decision making that goes into that hardware. Apple got to decide what's going to go into their hardware. In the early days of iPhone, Apple did not make their own processors, but they still got to, they still were able to choose what processor belonged into their machine. So that was up to them, what they wanted that to look like. So, give me 1 second here. Performing a slight maneuver. Magic tricky thingy. Okay. So I just mentioned that with the early days of iPhone, you couldn't listen to music and check your email at the same time. Now that's something we take for granted today, right? It's like, oh, well, smartphones can do that. Our computers have been able to do that for years. We don't necessarily think back to, it wasn't until really mid 1990s, which I realized was a couple of minutes ago, but not until the mid 1990s could our normal computers let us do two things at once. They all only allowed a single application to run at once. So, we might say back then, well, why was that? Because that didn't have to make some of the decisions that mobile computers have to make today. So Android comes out, and Android doesn't have these limitations. It supports multitasking. Another thing that it supported, I don't remember if we talked about, did we talk about Flash last time? The Flash application?
Yeah, we did.
Okay. Yeah, so one comment I typically make about Flash is, it's phased out at this point, but so I'll just review it real quick for a minute. It's phased out at this point, but Adobe made a product called Flash, and a lot of our multimedia applications were on web pages used Flash to perform their task. Apple, right from the get-go, did not support Flash. They supported HTML5, kind of the competitor to Flash, or the what was supposed to be the replacement of Flash. And similar to how iPhone worked out, people were thinking Apple was, being stupid. Flash is the industry standard, yada, yada, yada. Nobody really paid attention to the fact that Flash was mobile version of Flash was terrible anyways. It wasn't really functional sitting there on your smartphone screen using a website that had Flash stuff. But on top of that, Flash was absolutely horrible for battery life. Beyond horrible, beyond your worst nightmares. Back then, the example I would use for people is I would have them open up a Flash application on like a fully charged laptop, which obviously has a much bigger battery than a smartphone. And if your laptop got, I don't know, let's say back then a long laptop battery was maybe 4 hours, something like that, you would have gotten like 40 minutes or less of battery time. I mean, it really cut down your maximum battery time by a lot, a huge percentage. So very similar argument. When Android first came out, it also supported Flash. It had all these things in it that iPhone didn't support. And so you can imagine what the commercials looked like. So you're watching these iPhone or these Apple versus Android commercials. And, they all did that spin on it. All the Android commercials are, oh, we can do this, we can do this, Apple can't do that, yada, yada, yada. They're talking about all these perceived features, these things that users think that they want to be able to do. Because as a consumer, as a normal consumer, it probably felt unreasonable that we can't check our email or use the web browser, the really cool things that this new smartphone claims is now in our pocket. And not just that this was the first time the web was in our pocket, but it's the first time that a usable version of the web was in our pocket. Because before that, the web on a mobile device, a mobile phone or something like that was a hack at best. Like maybe you can get the phone number of a place if you had to. It was not a roughly equivalent browsing experience to what we have today. But you can imagine all the consumers really focused on that, because what are they trying to do? They're trying to sell devices. And the consumer, us, we don't understand why those decisions were made. And those decisions were made for a device and architecture reason. So what I talked about with Flash, or what I presume I talked about with Flash, is that battery life thing. Because when we think about our mobile devices, the first thing that pops up in bright lights when we're thinking about what we care about is battery life. Sure, we want a bright screen, we want a big screen, we want a good keyboard. Now all the keyboards are touch keyboards, right? In the earlier days, there was this big debate between, physical keyboards that had the physical buttons like the BlackBerry versus the touchscreen keyboard like the iPhone. I don't even know if you can buy a smartphone now that has the physical keyboard on it. I haven't seen one in years. Maybe some company still makes one, but for a long time, that was a real divide. Like, it was people would be out searching for something that was using one of the newer operating systems. Actually, they would have been Android, because iPhone never had the physical keyboard. But one of the newer operating systems, but still had the Blackboard kind of key, the BlackBerry kind of keyboard that they loved. So that was, there was a lot of things we kind of took for granted there. And when you watch these commercials, we really saw these technology companies telling us what we thought we wanted, but for the wrong reason. And it really, I feel in retrospect, is kind of embarrassing for Google, even though at the time Google maybe seemed like they were the cool kid, because they sounded like they were giving us everything we wanted. We wanted long battery life. Now, Google didn't talk about them having long battery life. In fact, they had horrible battery life. In the early days, the Apple memes would have been that, these people are carrying around their Android device, and they were carrying a car battery in a backpack behind them or something like that to keep the thing turned on. Because like I said, if you're running a website that has Flash, which is something that all the commercials pointed to, that, oh, Android supports Flash. If you were on a website that supported Flash, you were going to get like 10 minutes of battery life on your phone. That was it. It was going to burn through your battery like nothing. And then that's actually exacerbated with this next comment, the idea of multitasking, which is kind of where we started here. iPhone did not support multitasking. And once users got over the initial sparkle of, oh, how awesome the web browser is and stuff, then they started deciding, oh, well, we want everything, so let's complain about things. So, hey, this doesn't have multitasking. I want to be able to do two things at once. What gives? My computer's been able to do it for years. Apple doesn't necessarily give a whole lot of explanation. Apple's like, hey, it's our way or the highway. Android comes out, it has multitasking right off the bat, and they really focused on that in all of their commercials. This is why we're so much better. But here's where the problem comes in for us, what our focus is in here. Android was kind of rushed to market. Keep in mind that that very first year, nobody knew how successful Apple was going to be with the iPhone. Once it was obvious that, oh, this is the thing, Google or some other company, there was a couple other competitor companies, but obviously, you know, we've kind of landed on two giant competitors, Android versus iOS. Google was trying to get Android out as soon as possible. And what they did is they took what's known to be a solid operating system. Most of you have heard of it, Linux. All right, so they took a Unix type operating system that is considered very stable, all these things. And they say, okay, well, we're going to build a mobile user interface on top of a known good operating system. Well, the question then comes into, what does it mean for an operating system to be good? And that's where things get a little bit interesting because when we think about our operating system on our desktop computers, where we're not necessarily, although we do think about it now with battery life on our laptops, but that seems to be less of a focus since now our laptops last long enough. But typically, when a computer is plugged into the wall, getting an unlimited amount of electricity, a lot of those decisions that we care about with our smartphone are things we don't necessarily care about on our desktop. And Linux is considered to be a very, very, very good, stable, yada, yada, yada operating system. So, hey, there are worse operating systems for you to copy stuff off of than Linux. That makes a lot of sense. So that's what they did. They said, oh, our fastest way to get to market is to take a base operating system like Linux, and let's get this guy to market with a mobile user interface that we can, duplicate off of, let's say off of Apple initially, and then make our own little twists and turns and stuff like that. Because, obviously people didn't love everything about iPhone. So that wasn't necessarily a major problem. So they come out with that operating system. And all the commercials right away are talking about how Android has multitasking. You can have more than one thing at once, yada, yada, yada. And people viewed that as better than iPhone. Because on the surface, the way we thought about using our computers, that did sound better. But it wasn't. When we think about multitasking, we have to think about, how is multitasking implemented? And we're going to be talking about software for a few minutes here rather than the hardware, but the idea of a computer architecture, that software working together with the hardware is a pretty important piece. So it's not like we're going off the reservation here. We're just kind of connecting the dots. So typically multitasking is a feature of the operating system. All right, that's what we're looking at with multitasking. It's a feature the operating system brings in. And even when you go to older computers, desktop, remove the mobile world, and you go to desktop computers and you're comparing like the Mac OS, like Mac OS 8 versus Windows 98, so probably a decent comparison. Both of these operating systems are well into the years that they supported multitasking. Well into, this isn't year 2, this is, I don't know, year 9 or something like that. But they did it very differently. And this is actually kind of a similar argument, and I'm trying to think in the way to explain it. The problem is as I get older and older and older, I'm not able to use the examples of how many of you used Mac OS 9 or Mac OS 8. Did anybody in here ever use Mac OS 8? So is that a thing?
No, so most of us use Windows.
No. Yeah, I wonder how old, what year was OS 8? That had to be in maybe early or very early 2000s, maybe even earlier. That might even been in the 90s. Hey. Okay, well, whatever. But an interesting thing is Mac OS 8 or some older versions of Apple computers, they used a type of multitasking called preemptive multitasking. It was a different approach to multitasking than Windows used. They were considered to be legitimate competitors at the time, but the issue was it's kind of, do you want your cake and eat it too? And that is, well, what's most important in our initial mind, and this is kind of related to this idea of human greed that we're going to keep talking about here. What do we want out of multitasking? Well, if we're talking about our smartphones here, well, at the very least, I should be able to listen to my music and check email at the same time. I should be able to do that. That's important. Fine. But now let's say that that works. You can do that. Well, now the thing that's running in the background should still run well in the background. You know, we keep adding to the pile. Humans are greedy. We're never quite happy with what we have. So with preemptive multitasking in these older Apple computers, and they got their operating system from somebody else. So it's, you know, this is just how business works. It's not really a Apple is at fault problem. But when you put an application in the background to use something else in the foreground, that application was given just enough CPU time to keep it alive, but it wasn't given enough CPU time for it to actually do stuff. And that could be seen. This is overlapped in the early days of the internet, of people really using the internet for downloading files and stuff like that. So if you had a large file that you were downloading in the background on a Mac, so let's say you started something downloading and then you went and were browsing the web and you came back an hour later, your progress on that download would have been very, very, very slow, because the downloading application was only getting enough CPU time to barely remain alive, not get anything else out of it. Let's see. Oh, Emily said it was released in 97. Well, some of you there were people in here born in 97, right? Is that 90? Oh, maybe not. Is everybody in here under 25? I hate all of you. So in any case, their implementation of multitasking didn't give the user everything that they wanted. It gave the user everything they thought they wanted at the beginning. Whereas the implementation of multitasking on the Windows side, it did not slow things down in the background. And that's not like, oh, we decided to make it run fast in the background. It was when they made certain decisions, and some of you have run into this before. You've been writing some software application, and you've made a certain decision that you say, well, do I want to do it this way, or do I want to do it this other way? And you chose one way, and it made sense to you, and then it ended up having consequences later on down the line. And maybe you were too far down before you realized that was the case, and you're like, well, I'm not going to go and redo it because that's going to cause too much time, yada yada yada. So that was the case with the Mac OSs back then. They got rid of that problem when they switched to OS X. They're Unix based. It's kind of an interesting thing. I'm about to complain why Android chose Linux as their core operating system for mobile, whereas Apple fixed many of their problems by choosing Unix as their core part of their operating system when they jumped from OS 9 to OS X, which had an architecture issue, which we will talk about, but I don't want to get off. That's less about mobile and more about the focus on the architecture. So let's keep going with this iPhone Android thing. So when we talk about multitasking, it's a feature of the operating system. The OS manages the CPU part of the architecture, and what it should work on at a particular time. All right, so that's kind of, and we can talk about, I mean, in this class, that would be more of an operating systems class thing to talk about the various ways of doing process management at the CPU level. But in here, we can just accept that, okay, well, the operating system, the software is going to make some of those decisions, and ultimately it dictates how the processor handles the processes running on the operating system. Now, you also have to remember in these early days of our mobile devices, iPhone versus Android, our processors were single core processors. We talked something about the CPU last time. How many things can a CPU do at once? One thing per processor core, I think is an easy way to look at it. Things get a little bit weird in there when we start talking about something called pipelining in computer architecture, where you can sort of line things up in such a way that multiple things show up on the CPU sort of kind of at the same time. So you're not quite getting double performance, but you're getting, I don't know, 1.8 things at a time, something like that. But a good math, easy math for us is to say that for every processor core we have, we can do one thing actually at the same time. All right, so that's how many things the CPU can do at once. We can fake this through software, where the CPU is expected to do things really fast, and we can just have it work on different applications in sequential order. The human believes it is in parallel. All right, so it's a job of the operating system to manage these things. Now, in the early days of mobile, and actually when we already have multi-core processors when iPhone first came out, but we didn't have the octa-core and now we have desktop processors, especially for server class things that have like 48 cores in them. So it's a lot of multitasking capabilities just from hardware. The operating system doesn't necessarily have to do too much faking. It just has to say, okay, I have 48 resources that are ready to work. I just need to give stuff to the one that's not currently busy. That also has some difficulties to it as well, since in software, sometimes two things can't happen at once. Like the chicken or the egg problem. Something needs to occur before you can do the next thing. So you can't do those two things at the same time. But in the early days of our mobile devices, all the processors were single core processors, so they can only do one thing at once. Now, we still could have made the decision from a multitasking perspective to say, oh, well, let's go ahead and that processor, even though it was a slower processor than what was in our computers, wasn't running our Intel, at that time, it would have been like probably an Intel Pentium type processor, Celeron, whatever, something slower than we have now, but still way faster than was in the mobile devices. It was still fast relative to human beings. We could have just said, well, we'll just kind of have that guy cycle through and have it do a little bit of work on this application, maybe our email, a little bit of work on the music application, bounce back and forth between just those two. And as a human being, we're convinced that both of them are running at the same time. Well, here's the issue. We saw that in action with Android. Android used a desktop-based operating system, Linux, to get their mobile operating system to market quickly. And even though it had all of these features that we expected to be there when mobile first went live, because our expectations were set by our experience on desktop computers. And since it came from a desktop operating system, a lot of those features were there. The commercials painted the picture of, hey, see how much Apple sucks. We gave you what you wanted, when what we wanted is not what we should have wanted. Battery life on Android was terrible when it first came out. Why? Well, one of the main reasons why was their multitasking model. In fact, it was probably the biggest reason why. So the very thing that they're bragging about in their commercials is the same thing that that the consumer is complaining about, well, is related to the same thing the consumer is complaining about with battery life. Because their multitasking model was a very, very, very good multitasking model. It just happened to assume that your device was plugged into an electric outlet. It wasn't written with the mentality that you have limited amount of power to work with here. So it was making decisions to switch between applications and these expensive things called context switching, things like that. It was doing these things often to give the end user the experience they thought they wanted at the cost of terrible battery life. And that was not a trade-off people were actually willing to make. So we would say here, iOS did not support, Android did support, to the detriment of the battery. And it was bad, like really bad battery life, borderline unusable. And also keep in mind that these applications were fairly immature applications, so they weren't doing everything that we would have expected. You weren't doing some of the productivity stuff we actually do on our smartphones today. All right.
Do you have like a number or like knowledge of how much it's like? I know not a specific number, but maybe like an average of how much battery would be wasted. Like, let's say you switch applications, would it like drain?
Oh, like yeah, I
It's-
don't have like a percentage like how much it would drain when you switched applications. It probably didn't look that bad when you looked at it at that level. But if we
Okay.
operate off of you know, how people use their phones, even if we assume back then maybe people weren't quite as addicted to their smartphone as they are today, people still use the smartphone constantly. So today, one of the measuring sticks is, does your phone last an entire day? Because all of us, when we go to sleep, we could charge our phone. So the idea of having the phone last more than one day isn't really necessary. But does the phone last an entire day? The Android phones never lasted a day. They probably lasted, you probably were needing to charge at lunchtime. Like substantial charge. You might have been down to like 15% by the time lunch rolled around, assuming you started your day like at 7 or 8, something like that.
Okay.
Where maybe Apple was starting to run out of juice around 8 p.m. Something like
Okay.
that.
I see. Okay,
Yeah,
I see.
the early days of we weren't quite getting a full day out of stuff back then. You would have had to do some charging and or mess with screen brightness and things like that. Other things that give you some battery saving stuff. But you know, kind of what's interesting to us here is this decision making from these big companies. The companies are supposed to be smarter than us. They're supposed to help us have the good devices. As a consumer, we thought we wanted multitasking at our mobile device, and we didn't realize we were trading so much battery life. If we were presented with that option, like here's one version of a phone where you can only run one, you can listen to your music or you can check your email at one time, but you'll get, let's just say, a full day of battery. Or here's another device where you can listen to your music and check your email at the same time, but you're only going to get 4 hours of battery life. that might be a different decision that we were making at the time, especially when you consider the transition from products at the time. If I keep saying music because mobile music is a thing. I'm not a big music listener, but mobile music has been a thing for a long time. And when the early smartphones came out, we already had devices dedicated to playing music. So chances are, if you had an iPhone, you probably also had an iPod that you'd already had for a while. So, that could have been your music device, where your phone was people still cared that they were phones back then. I'm not sure we care as much now as we used to. We use them a higher percent of the time for non-phone things. But we cared more about maybe being able to do the big claim to fame was the web browsing stuff, email, like more like desktop type email, where you could do email on BlackBerry, but it wasn't as good. The YouTube app was on there initially, so people were watching videos on the go, where before that, the internet being overrun by cat videos wasn't necessarily the joke, because you didn't have as many people watching these internet videos as as they do today, because now everybody has it on the go. They would have had to park in front of their computer to watch that kind of stuff. So tons of industries, all these creator industries where people are, they're content creators and making thousands of dollars per month making YouTube videos, that didn't even exist before some of these things. So new industries were born out of some of these decisions. And a lot of times the consumer, we think one-minded. We want everything. We want to do this, and this, and we don't realize the consequences of that. And what I find fascinating in this history lesson is that Android should have known better. Google should have known better. But in their goal to get to market quick, at the cost of their consumer, because they were definitely inconveniencing the consumer. They were making decisions that I hope some smart person there saw was obvious, that, hey, you're using a desktop operating system to run a mobile device. This might cause some problems with battery. That should have been a question that would have been asked really early on. So kind of an interesting type thing that they let it go to that point, and then doubled down by going on to TV commercials and bragging about the what really were the worst features of their device, bragging about the multitasking, bragging about the flash support, things that made their device useless after 2 or 3, 4 hours. The other guy wasn't doing it, who had a much longer battery life, and they were using the same batteries. They were using the same processors. The physical hardware inside these devices were probably from the same manufacturers back then. Now Apple produces, well, we say they produce their own stuff. Really, they've probably just acquired some companies that make some of their own stuff. That's what big companies do. They buy up a company that used to make their stuff, and now they make their own stuff on paper, even though it's still coming out of the same factory as it used to come out of. All right. Now, when we think about our mobile devices, it is interesting how even today our mentality of what we're shopping for as computer users. I mean, we have transitioned our opinion of our smartphones to move away from, oh, that's a phone, to something that, okay, this is more like a computer, but we're still treating it different than our normal computers. A lot of us do gaming on our smartphones, and we use it for, software applications, not just for a phone. So other things we do care about. One thing I find a little bit fascinating is when you are buying a laptop or a desktop computer, the CPU and your amount of memory is something that's kind of on the forefront. When you're buying a new computer, a new Dell computer or HP or Mac, whatever, you're like, okay, well, I want at least 16 gigabytes of memory, and You know, oh, it's got a Core i5 processor in it. Okay, that's okay. That's probably the minimum processor I want. That usually comes with at least 2, if not 4 cores and a Core i5. So that's gonna do okay for me. So we focus up here in these areas, along with probably screen size for a laptop. But this really tells us the story of the performance of that machine. So what I find is fascinating is on mobile devices. So everybody in this room, or I presume a very high percentage of you, have a smartphone. How many of you know how much memory is in your smartphone? Similarly, how many of you know what processor you have and what speed your processor is in your smartphone? I'm gonna guess very few of you know those things, because it's not on the forefront. When you buy a new phone, some of the flagship phones like the Samsung Galaxy Notes and stuff like that, the phones on the Android side that are kind of just as expensive as the iPhone phones, when you buy them, sometimes they'll say, oh, this has, you know, 8 or 12 gigabytes of memory, and that's pretty big for a smartphone. And you know, Apple will sometimes announce in their specs how much memory it has, but it's not something they put up on one of their slides at their keynote, because the amount of memory that's in a phone is really less important as long as it has enough memory. Because even though you are multitasking-ish, you are not doing the same level of multitasking as you do on a desktop computer. You don't have, you know, the students make fun of me. What do I have open? And so I have a relatively small number of things open right now. But when I come back over here, I have you know, a zillion tabs open on my browser. This is actually a fairly small number of tabs as well. So I'm doing pretty good right now. But you know, I don't pay any attention to how many things I have open on my computer at one time. On my desktop or laptop, and that comes at the cost of some battery life, where on a phone, we're not as demanding of the operating system, even though we're not necessarily paying attention to it. That's just kind of a natural thing. But on our phones, we don't really think about the amount of RAM or the speed of the CPUs and things like that. We care more about battery life. We don't even think about GPUs. That's not even a conversation. We do think about storage, you know, because really we're usually thinking about how many pictures can we hold, or how much music can we hold, that kind of stuff. So keeping on with this multitasking argument, let's go here. Oh. How is multitasking implemented on mobile? All right, so even though in the early days of iOS and Android, we did not have strong, well, Android had bad multitasking, Apple had no multitasking. Now they both have usable multitasking. What changed? Apple was really the innovator on that side of things. At the time, they were looking pretty smart, like, oh, well, you know, Apple, you know, yeah, we didn't have multitasking for a long time because we waited until we figured out how to do it right. Something along those lines. How do we do multitasking the correct way? So what Apple did is, we're going to say Apple chose 8 different things that an application might want to do in the background. The programmer, because now the App Store is live. All right. So as a developer, you can start writing stuff for these mobile devices. The programmer can choose to use some or all of these, they were typically called hooks, to have their applications do something while in the background. So the people at Apple are sitting there and saying, you know, okay, what things should be able to occur while an application's in the background? The obvious thing based on the conversation we've had this morning is, oh, well, maybe music should be able to play. Okay, that doesn't seem like as a major heavy lifting type thing. It's not like the full application is running in the background. If you're just trying to get some aspect of it, you're not having a fully functional user interface where the user's clicking around and stuff like that. You're just picking a subcomponent of the application and saying this guy's going to run in the background. So Apple said, okay, well, if you want to allow your application to run in the background, that's fine. Here's the 8 things it might be able to do in the background. Maybe it's downloading some data. Maybe it's using network services where it's, maybe updating sports scores or something like that. Push notifications is a good example of things that are happening in the background. Those guys didn't exist in the early days of mobile computing either. These are things we take for granted today while we're sitting there and a zillion things are popping up on our screen from our phone with the latest updated sports scores, news headlines, whatever it is. Those things didn't used to bombard us. Now they do. But what they said is, okay, here's the things that we think you want to do in the background. And here's ways for you to have your applications leverage the mobile operating system. So leverage either iOS or on the Android side, leverage those operating systems to do just that task in the background. So even though you are still using some CPU time, you're using less CPU time because you're doing the bare minimum of what your application needs to do to remain living. And keep in mind that this was after a couple of years of the mobile devices being in existence. So battery technology kept getting better. Processor power usage processors were getting faster, more capable, and also using less energy. So everything was moving in that direction. And we've actually seen this over the last several years with our smartphones. And this is something you probably have noticed during your lifetimes, even though, because this is something more recent, maybe over the last like 5 years or so. There was, for a long time, there was this situation where the phones kept getting more and more compact. They kept getting smaller and smaller and smaller, so that we can push more power into them while still maintaining the battery life. If you watch the Apple or the Android keynotes every single year, they all kept talking about the battery life lasting about the same amount of time as it did the year before. So basically it was, hey, here's how much better our device is, and oh, it lasts just as long as it used to. So our screens were getting smaller and smaller and smaller, or at least we weren't looking at getting bigger screens. Now we've noticed our devices are starting to move. Almost every manufacturer has, your normal size screen. Usually the kind of the stock screen these days is like a 4.7-inch screen. Is like that's the normal size phone. There's usually a smaller version for some of these flagship things. But now they all have these jumbo screen phones. It's usually something XL or whatever. We're moving back in the direction of big screens. Well, if for a long time we kept moving away from the giant bright screens to save battery life, because that's one of our main uses of power on our mobile phones is that big screen. Now we're moving back towards larger screens, or at least the option of having larger screens. Has something drastically changed in the actual power consumption of our devices? Not really. We've gotten better at making batteries. So our batteries have a lot more power in it. And we're not even caring about how compact it is. I mean, I don't know how well you can see it here on the screen, but so this is my phone. I have one of those Galaxy Fold phones. So I have this giant screen on here. And my phone lasts all day, but I presume there's quite a bit of battery inside of this device because I effectively have two phones laying right next to each other when I have this thing opened all the way up. So when it's folded, it's like a double thick phone. I probably can't see that with how my background is going, but the trade-off is maybe the phones become less compact, and what we gain out of it is we still have long battery life, but now we can have a big screen. All right, so those choices then trend us in the direction of moving our mobile phones more towards multitasking computers, and we're seeing that on the tablet side too. You now have iPads and iPad Pros where, and Microsoft has their Surface things, which are kind of, half normal computer, half tablet. So they're starting as a normal computer, moving towards a tablet, where Apple is starting as a tablet, trying to move closer to a normal computer. So you're seeing competition there. And now you're seeing the smartphones have a category that's kind of, what do they call them? Phablets. It's a phone and a tablet kind of hybridized, where you have a pretty good size mobile device. But in any case, when they had to start coming up with multitasking for real, keeping in mind that the users wanted it since day one. Users wanted multitasking, or at least they thought they wanted it since day one. They didn't necessarily want the consequences, but they also were not aware of the consequences. Instead, they just operated off of, oh, Apple's just doing things their way and Android's better because they gave us multitasking. And then everybody just keeps hush hush about the battery life issue. But Apple came out with this idea of, okay, here's the things we might want to have running in the background, and we're going to manage those at the operating system level so that we still have total control over how much power your applications get. So we're going to let you kind of limp into multitasking without you just saying, okay, I can do whatever I want multitasking. It's within, here's the ground rules. And that then allowed us to kind of get to where we are today. I don't know that the atmosphere of mobile apps has drastically changed in terms of what they tend to do in the background today than when we first introduced multitasking, probably in maybe iPhone 4. It's probably the first multitasking, possibly iPhone 3G, probably year 3, something like that, of iPhone, somewhere in that ballpark. When they first started coming out with those things. Then, Android updated. They didn't really talk about it. They didn't really say, okay, well, now we have, they said that we have better battery life, but they didn't really say how they accomplished that. They moved to a multitasking model more based on mobile mentalities, just like Apple did. So Google got to market with a Linux-based operating system and then massaged that down to something that was taking mobile considerations there. Apple started off with an operating system made for mobile and maybe felt a little bit limited initially because of the decisions that they made, but those decisions were made for good technical reasons. Well, now what's happened is Apple, because our battery life has gotten so much better and processor management has gotten better and our operating systems are smarter, yada, yada, yada. Now we've actually allowed our applications to do more stuff in the background. So Apple's multitasking model today looks a lot more like Android's original multitasking model. It's not a duplicate, but it does allow some original desktop type things to happen in the background. Because now you have situations where you can have two applications running side by side, for example, on our larger devices, like an iPad, for example. Well, now you're having to give full processor power to both of those applications because it's not just playing music in the background. Now you're using the whole user interface, swiping, clicking, all this stuff. That's two applications fully running at once. Maybe one's using one core versus another core, whatever. So CPU management. I'll start the conversation about this. So we have to talk about the evolution of our processors in our mobile devices. In the early days, our processors were single core mobile chips, mobile processors, and they're not running your, Intel processors that were sitting inside your desktop computers, because those use a lot of electricity. You would have gotten like 10 minutes of battery life. Literally, it would have really burned through your battery pretty quickly. But we have these low power consumption CPUs that are slower than desktop, that geared towards the needs of mobile. Now, over the years, we've gotten better and better and better at making mobile devices, really making processors in general. When you go out and you buy a computer processor, sometimes, especially on laptops, one thing you'll see sometimes is you'll see something like this is using 15 nanometer technology, something like that, or 8 nanometer technology. Anybody know what they mean when they're talking about the number of nanometers in the technology used to make a processor? What are they referring to? I always find it entertaining when these tech companies, they like to throw the smart buzzwords out that really is meaningless to most people, but it sounds good. I almost think about it like some of the commercials I see for like cosmetics, like this moisturizer with, real pine tree oil, or like, I mean, is that good for you? Should you be having pine tree oil? It's got the real stuff in it. So I always thought that's kind of funny. But this nanometer stuff, this has to do with our manufacturing process. When you build a processor, they're on these things called printed circuit boards. And so we have these machines that are able to, they're effectively laying wire at the microscopic level, let's say. And the smaller the nanometers, that's the closer they can put those wires together without interference. So almost think of it like high resolution printing. Okay, so the higher the smaller the nanometer, the higher the resolution, the more they can fit into a small space. So they're wasting less and less space without actually physically increasing the size of the processor. Something like that. So over the years, we've gotten better and better and better at making super tiny versions of our big boy processors. So when when a desktop processor comes out, a Core i7, Intel Core i7 processor comes out, and they decide that they're going to have a desktop that starts off in the desktop, and then they want to have a mobile version of that. They don't just take the desktop version and plop it into a laptop, because that hasn't taken in some of the consideration of the laptop, if nothing else, the form factor. If you have ever built your own desktop computer and you have an Intel Core i7 processor in there, you have, a chip that's probably, 2 inches by 2 inches square. And then you usually have this giant heat sink that sits on top of it to dissipate heat. Now, I don't know about you, but you probably don't want to have a laptop that is, 6 inches thick. That's it's just burning your leg off. This is probably not your preferred way of using your computer. So they have to come up with, how do we get that same architecture into a laptop? And you're not going to be looking at one-to-one performance. You're giving up something when you start thinking about heat consumption or the amount of heat it's giving off, and cooling. How do we cool that processor? Because the hotter a processor works, the less performance you're going to get out of it. So keeping it cool is going to get you your best performance. So where's that sweet spot in mobile where we can have the same features of our desktop processors, giving us a performance level that is within spitting distance, because at that point, when you're talking about on the high end stuff, you really are talking about the difference between, 92% of really, 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 really fast compared to 100% of that. The end user is not necessarily going to notice a majority of the time, but if you're pitting two machines that look like they have the same specs, and one of them is a desktop computer and one of them is a laptop computer, you are probably going to get different benchmarks because of some of the decisions that had to be made at the laptop level. So we talk about CPU management. How do we make them smaller or get more stuff into the same space? We talk about heat management. And then we talk about multi-core trade-offs, fast/slow cores. And I'll say start here. Okay. So I think your next assignment is due on Thursday. Is that correct? I think there's a paper due Thursday. Does that sound accurate to everybody? So I'll try to get all the papers that you already turned in graded today. We'll pick up with the processor comparisons on Thursday, where we're going to talk about having fast cores and slow cores on mobile, which allows us to save some processing power, save some electricity, things like that. And then we'll just keep trucking from there.
Just so you know, Littman, the homework for Thursday is not up on Blackboard. It's not like open or whatever.
Are you lying?
No, I didn't see it either. So it's homework 2. You said homework. Yeah, homework 2 is up right now. That deals with the compiler.
Yeah. That's what I meant. So
Oh, wait,
you should have 2 papers due already, right?
right.
One of them was due. Oh, was the other one due today?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
That's
Yeah,
what
that's all
you-
I'm talking about. Sorry about that.
Okay.
So then I'll try to get both of those graded by Thursday.
Okay.
All right. Okay. Well, so questions, comments, concerns, bribes. All right. I will see everybody on Thursday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.